For nearly 5 decades, Graceland stood frozen in time, honoring Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll.
For nearly 5 decades, one door at Graceland stayed shut, not locked away because it was forgotten, not sealed off because nobody cared, but deliberately, quietly, and purposefully kept from the world. That door led to the attic above Elvis Presley's bedroom. And for 48 years, not a single person walked through it. No family member, no historian, no world leader, no matter how famous or powerful they were. The tour guides always gave the same rehearsed answer when curious visitors craned their necks toward the roped-off staircase. The upstairs is private, out of respect for the family. And somehow, for nearly half a century, that answer was enough to keep the world at bay. But in January of 2025, that all changed. A small team of archivists in white gloves climbed those narrow stairs for the first time since August of 1977. The air was thick with dust. The silence was almost physical. And what they found inside didn't just surprise them. It shook them, because the attic of Graceland wasn't forgotten storage space piled with random belongings. It was something far more deliberate, far more human, and far more heartbreaking than anyone could have prepared for. To understand why that attic matters so deeply, you have to go back to the beginning, back to 1957, when a 22-year-old kid from Tupelo, Mississippi pulled his car to the iron gates of a white-column mansion on the edge of Memphis, Tennessee. The property had 13.5 acres of rolling land, stables, barns, and open fields. It had been built in 1939 by a doctor named Thomas Moore, who named it Graceland after his Aunt Grace. When Elvis Presley bought it for just over $100,000 in today's money, he didn't change the name. He said it fit. And over the next 2 decades, he turned it into something the world had never seen before and hasn't seen since. Graceland wasn't just a home. It was a personality. The jungle room with its green shag carpet crawling up the walls and across the ceiling. The television room in the basement where Elvis had 3 screens installed, so he could watch multiple channels at once, a luxury in the 1960s that most Americans couldn't have imagined. The meditation garden with its white columns and stone fountains, a quiet corner he built himself when the noise of fame became too loud to bear. And then there were the animals. Horses, peacocks, and most famously, a chimpanzee named Scatter, who Elvis dressed in tiny suits and brought to parties, where the mischievous animal would pull at women's skirts and steal drinks from unsuspecting guests. People who worked at Graceland used to say Scatter was a part of Elvis he kept hidden in public, wild and untamed and completely free. But there was always a floor nobody talked about. The second floor, where Elvis slept, where he spent his private hours, and where, on the afternoon of August 16, 1977, his girlfriend Ginger Alden pushed open a bathroom door and found him collapsed on the floor. He was 42 years old. His face had already turned a deep shade of blue. By 3:30 that afternoon, doctors at Baptist Memorial Hospital pronounced him dead. The official story came quickly. Dr. Jerry Francisco, the medical examiner assigned the case, stood before reporters that same evening and delivered a clean, simple verdict. Cardiac arrhythmia. His heart had simply stopped. Natural causes. Nothing more to investigate. Nothing more to explain. But even in 1977, people who had watched Elvis perform over the previous year could see that the story didn't quite add up. The man on stage had changed almost beyond recognition. He had gained enormous weight. He forgot the words to his own songs. There were nights he could barely stand without support. This wasn't a man who had simply died of natural causes at 42. Something had been going wrong for a long, long time. When the toxicology reports eventually surfaced, they told the story the official verdict had buried. Elvis's blood contained dangerously high levels of at least 10 different prescription medications at the time of his death, including powerful opioids, sedatives, and stimulants. The man who had changed the course of American music had spent his final years in a pharmaceutical fog, cycling between amphetamines that kept him awake for days and heavy sleeping pills that knocked him out cold. His doctor, a man the inner circle knew simply as Dr. Nick, had written nearly 10,000 prescriptions for Elvis in just the 8 months before his death. That works out to roughly 1 prescription every day and a half. For years, Dr. Nick defended himself by saying he was trying to wean Elvis off the medications gradually, that giving them to him was safer than letting him find them elsewhere. In 1995, the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners disagreed. They revoked his license permanently. A 2020 book by researcher Sally Hodel added another layer to the story, suggesting that Elvis may have suffered from a genetic condition called alpha, 1 antitrypsin deficiency, a disorder affecting the lungs and liver that was poorly understood in his era. If Hodel's research is correct, Elvis wasn't simply a man who made reckless choices. He was a genuinely ill person trying to manage real, chronic pain with the limited medical understanding of his time, surrounded by people who were more focused on keeping him performing than keeping him alive. After Elvis died, the grief was immediate and overwhelming. Nearly 100,000 fans descended on Memphis within days. They lined the streets for miles, wept outside the iron gates, and waited hours just to file past his casket inside Graceland, where he lay in a white suit and blue tie. On August 18th, 17 white Cadillacs led his funeral procession through the city. James Brown was there. Sammy Davis Jr. was there. A 9-year-old girl named Lisa Marie Presley stood beside her grandfather, Vernon, watching her father's coffin move through the streets of the city he had put on the map. But the peace his family had hoped for didn't last even 2 full days. In the early hours after his burial at Forest Hill Cemetery, a group of men attempted to break into the tomb and steal his body. They were caught before they succeeded, but the attempt was enough to terrify Vernon Presley completely. Working quietly with Memphis police, he had Elvis and his mother Gladys disinterred and reburied in the meditation garden at Graceland, the peaceful corner Elvis had built himself nearly 20 years earlier. The garden became a grave, and Graceland became something closer to a fortress. Vernon added security systems, hired round-the-clock guards, and permanently closed the second floor and attic to everyone, including most of the family. When he passed away in 1979, those restrictions remained. When Graceland opened to tourists in 1982, visitors were allowed to walk to the kitchen, admire the living room's stained glass windows, stand silently at the graves in the meditation garden, and marvel at the gold records and rhinestone jumpsuits in the trophy building. But the staircase was always roped off. The attic door was always locked, and the questions never stopped. For 48 years, the theories multiplied. Some people insisted Elvis had never actually died, pointing to oddities like the unusual weight of his coffin, the spelling of his middle name on his gravestone, and a man fitting his description purchasing a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires from Memphis Airport on the evening of August 16th, using a name Elvis had occasionally used while traveling. Tabloids ran citing stories for decades. Websites dedicated to proving Elvis was still alive emerged in the early internet era. Even today, online communities debate the possibility with unsettling seriousness. For the Presley family, these conspiracy theories always created a painful double bind. Deny them too forcefully, and people assumed you were hiding something. Stay silent, and the rumors grew louder. Then, in the spring of 2024, something happened that threatened to make all those questions irrelevant by taking Graceland itself away from the family entirely. A company called Nosny Investments and Private Lending quietly filed paperwork to force the auction of Graceland, claiming that Riley Keough, Elvis's granddaughter and the sole heir to his estate following her mother Lisa Marie's death in 2023, had defaulted on a loan of nearly $4 million. The news hit the Elvis community like a thunderclap. Fan forums flooded with panic. The idea of Graceland, the meditation garden, the jungle room, the roped-off staircase, falling into the hands of strangers was almost too much to process. Riley's legal team moved fast. They filed an emergency injunction in Shelby County, Tennessee, arguing that the entire scheme was fraudulent. The signatures on the loan documents, they claimed, had been forged. Riley had never signed anything with Nosny Investments. She had never taken out the loan they were claiming she defaulted on. And crucially, when the day of the scheduled auction arrived, nobody from Nosny Investments showed up in court to defend their claim. A Tennessee judge halted the sale, calling Graceland a one-of-a-kind cultural asset whose loss would cause irreparable harm to the public. Graceland stayed in Presley hands. The near loss of the estate seemed to crystallize something for Riley. Her mother, Lisa Marie, had known about the attic and had chosen to honor her father's wish to keep it private during her lifetime. But with Lisa Marie gone and with the estate having just survived a very real threat, Riley made a decision that no one in her family had made in nearly 50 years. She authorized the opening of the attic. On a cold January morning in 2025, a team of professional archivists wearing white conservation gloves climbed a narrow staircase for the first time since the summer Elvis died. The lead archivist turned an old brass key that had been in the Presley family's possession for 48 years. The door opened with a creak that seemed to carry the weight of every year it had been closed. What they found was not chaos. It was not neglect. It was not a forgotten jumble of storage boxes and old costumes. It was something that stopped every person in the room completely cold. The attic had been organized, carefully, deliberately, and with an almost museum-like precision. Boxes lined the walls, each one labeled in Elvis's own handwriting, sorted by chapter of his life. Tupelo, 1945. First recordings. Army days. Hollywood. Vegas. And one box, set slightly apart from the others, marked simply after, with the year 1977 written beneath it. A single air conditioning unit hummed quietly in the corner. The maintenance staff at Graceland had kept it running all these years without ever setting foot inside the room. Because of that one machine, almost everything in the attic had been preserved in near-perfect condition. The archivist worked slowly and methodically, photographing every item before touching it, cataloging each piece with the care normally reserved for national museums. And as they moved through the sections, the picture that emerged wasn't the Elvis of the rhinestone jumpsuits and Las Vegas spectacle. It was the Elvis almost nobody had ever been allowed to see. In the Tupelo section, they found a small teddy bear with one eye missing and patches sewn onto its chest and arms. Family records identified it as Bear, Elvis's childhood companion from the years when his family had almost nothing. The patches had been sewn by his mother Gladys, using scraps from her own clothing. You could still make out the faded floral patterns of the fabric she had chosen. When Vernon Presley was jailed for check fraud in 1938, leaving Gladys and little Elvis nearly destitute in a two-room house in Mississippi, that bear was what the boy held on to. Elvis had kept it for the rest of his life and brought it with him to the very top of his most famous home. In the Army Days section, a Bible waited that had been read so thoroughly its spine had been reinforced with electrical tape. It had belonged to Gladys, who gave it to Elvis when he was drafted in 1958. Inside the front cover, she had written him a message. Throughout the pages, Elvis had left a trail of underlined verses, handwritten questions, and small personal prayers. The last annotation was dated just days before his death, in August 1977. He had marked Psalm 23. The Hollywood section told a quieter, sadder story. A leather jacket made for his role in Jailhouse Rock had a folded note tucked into the pocket. It read, "Wear this when you need to disappear." Elvis had spoken in interviews about feeling trapped by his own image, unable to walk down a street or sit in a restaurant without becoming a spectacle. That jacket was apparently his attempt at camouflage, a way to slip outside the prison of his own fame for an hour or two. Beside was a stack of books on Eastern philosophy, comparative religion, and metaphysics, most of them heavily annotated. It was the private intellectual life of a man the public had always seen as pure instinct and charisma. In the Vegas section, the archivist found something that made everyone in the room go very still. A medical report from 1974, stamped confidential in red letters. Its full contents remained sealed pending family review, but the cover page referenced serious cardiac concerns and strongly recommended major lifestyle changes. Elvis kept performing for 3 more years after that report was written. 3 more years of sold-out shows, of standing ovations, of an audience that had no idea what the man on stage already knew about his own heart. And then there were the tapes, reel-to-reel recordings labeled Practice Sessions, 1976, in plain handwriting. Private recordings never intended for anyone else. On them, Elvis explored sounds nobody had ever associated with him, mixing gospel, blues, and experimental electronic textures in combinations that felt decades ahead of their time. And then, near the end of one reel, a recording that silenced the entire archival team. A bare, unaccompanied version of Unchained Melody, recorded just months before he died. No instrumentation, no production, just his voice, cracking in places, thick with something that went beyond performance. A music historian brought in to assess the recordings later said it sounded like a man saying goodbye through a song, not to an audience, but to himself. There were also letters, hundreds of them, still sealed in their original envelopes, never opened. Letters from soldiers whose morale had been lifted by his music. Letters from families describing how his songs had carried them through devastating losses. Letters from young musicians asking for advice and guidance. One letter, postmarked 1976, urged him in urgent, heartfelt terms to stop touring and take care of his health before it was too late. He never read it. What the attic of Graceland contained, in the end, wasn't a secret scandal or a hidden confession or evidence of a conspiracy. It contained something far more piercing than any of those things. It contained a man, a real, complicated, deeply feeling human being who had carried his childhood poverty and his mother's love and his private doubts and his intellectual hunger all the way to the top of the most famous house in rock and roll and kept him hidden there, safe in a world that had turned him into an icon instead of a person. Riley Keough has said that opening the attic was about documentation, not necessarily public disclosure. The family is still deciding what to share and when. But even the fragments that have emerged have already changed something in the way people understand Elvis Presley. Not the sequin performer, not the conspiracy theory, not the tragedy. The person, the boy who kept a patched teddy bear, the soldier who read his mother's Bible in the dark, the man who hid a note in a jacket pocket, just to give himself permission to disappear for a little while. For 48 years, the door stayed shut. And now that it's finally open, what's on the other side turns out to be the most human thing imaginable. A life, carefully folded and quietly set aside by someone who knew better than anyone that the world rarely lets its legends be ordinary. Elvis kept his ordinary self in that attic. And somehow, that feels like the most important thing he ever did.